Now, if we are forced into that position, it seems to me that there are two rules which we can observe to make the exercise more meaningful. The first rule is that I, as a Black historian, am speaking to fellow Blacks. Now, that means that as far as the white audience is concerned, here and in the world at large, they are perfectly entitled to listen, but I am not engaged in the game which they set up, by which they say to me, you prove, Black, that you're a man. Prove it to me by showing that you have civilization and that sort of thing. I'm not engaged in that job as far as white people are concerned. I am engaged with, I must address myself solely to Black brothers, to the extent that they have been involved and destroyed in a process we are seeking to recreate. And furthermore, as I said, it's in the service of Black revolution. Those whites, those few whites who may join the Black revolution will certainly do so for reasons which are far more profound than their knowledge or acquaintance with African history. So that's another reason why we don't need to address ourselves to them. The second rule is that African history must be seen as very intimately linked to the contemporary struggle of Black people. One must not set up any false distinctions between reflection and action. We are just another facet of the ongoing revolution. This is not a theory. It is a fact that Black people everywhere in Africa and in the Western world are already on the march. So nobody who wants to be relevant to that situation can afford to withdraw and decide that he is engaging in what is essentially an intellectual exercise. But curiously, Egypt is well entrenched in Africa, but it never appears in any assessment of African civilization. In other words, what I am trying to say, why I am taking this single point, is to show the ways in which the issue can be evaded. White society can either say you have had no history, or where they see an element of civilization in their terms, they can say that was not yours, either by saying it outright or ignoring it. In the case of Egypt, a second argument is advanced, the question of color. If you press the first argument I made, then a white person will say, well, you know, the people in Egypt were white, so that really it has nothing to do with Africa, which is a place for Black people. In that sense, one will have to go back and try to determine what was the racial composition of dynastic Egypt. And as far as we can tell, the Egyptians represented themselves as red or copper colored, as distinct from lighter skinned white peoples living outside of Egypt, and as distinct from darker skinned Black peoples living outside of Egypt also to the south, so that their own conception of themselves was certainly not white. Furthermore, the whole history of Egypt is one of southward expansion and of contacts, sometimes not very pleasant contacts, in the form of slave raids with the South, so that it is clear that the whole Egyptian population must have been infused with a large quantity of Black blood, if we want to take it in racial terms. For the whole of the 8th century BC, the Egyptian dynasty was actually in the hands of the Nubians, in the hands of the Empire of Kush. In other words, for that period, Black men were ruling the society. I'm only making this distinction in terms of race because we are attempting to break down certain myths. In other words, if we look at Egyptian society, we see that it certainly was not white. We can take the medial position that it was brown and that it had very large elements of Black, including a whole Black dynasty. So this is just to illustrate the ways in which, even within the terminology which Europeans have established, one can indicate that African history exists, that African civilizations exist, that the Black man can look back on this and gain the necessary revolutionary inspiration. I know this from personal experience. I go to a Black and you can see anguish in him. He says to you, I want to know something about the great achievements of Africans. Tell me something striking. So you start to tell him about Lalibela and about rock churches shorn out of sheer rock in Egypt. You tell him about the pilgrimages of Mansa Musa to Egypt. 100 years after, people in Egypt were still recalling it. He carried so much gold that years afterwards, the Egyptian economy was still disjointed. You tell him about the sculpture of Benin and Ife and suggest to him that these things are the marvel of the modern European world. But then you go further. I would go further. I'm suggesting to the Black brothers and sisters that we need to go further than that in illustrating these principles, which I indicated earlier. For an actual political purpose related to the revolution, we have to indicate that this cultural basis existed quite independent of states, because if not, there are certain types of contradictions into which we fall. Here I have in mind the way in which the white world normally plays up certain aspects of African contemporary development as relapses into barbarism. You say that what's happening in Nigeria, what happened in Congo, this is sort of atavism. The blacks have gone back to the primeval savagery once the restraining hand of white civilization has been removed. And to counter that type of nonsense, one doesn't only have to point to the development of so-called civilization, one also has to show these aspects of everyday life which were meaningful long before the Europeans arrived.